What I want to look at now is the cultural impact of some of the other people groups on the early Roman Republic. So I want to take a look at Etruscan influence on Rome, because they were obviously involved very early on in Roman civilization, right? The developing Roman city-state. The Greeks as well. Southern Italy, remember, is covered by Greek settlements, and the Greeks are going to have more and more and more of an impact on Roman culture. As a matter of fact, most people think of ancient Rome as just a continuation of ancient Greek culture, which is somewhat unfair because there are differences and distinctions. So let's take a look at some of the impacts very quickly of these cultures on ancient Rome. Etruscan and Greek influence on Rome. So let's start with traditional Roman virtues and values. What was the traditional Roman man supposed to be? Well, the values that the Romans admired were the values of pietas, gratuitas, virtus, among other things. And what those are, piety, for the most part, is how pietas is often translated. But to understand piety, we have in mind generally some kind of religious devotion, right? This idea of praying a lot. Now, the Romans were a very religious people. We'll see Roman religion very soon, but pietas for the Romans was more complicated. It was a system of hierarchical duty that one had. So to be pious was really a quality of being loyal to the state. Now, the hierarchy of duty usually extended from the gods at the top, obedience to the gods, to your role as a citizen to the state, then to people that depend on you and your family, and at the very end of the hierarchy is your duties to yourself, right, to your own happiness and pleasure. So really the traditional Roman put the gods first, the state second, and all the other obligations below that, always with themselves at the end, ideally. All right. Now, in this late Republican era, we'll eventually talk about, and I think this is going to be a presentation that one of your groups are going to be dealing with, which is the poetry of Virgil, known as the Aeneid. All right, now I'm not going to talk about the Aeneid in this class very much. I will bring it up a little bit as we cover this period of history. But if you take my mythology course, I'll do an entire section of the course on the Aeneid. It's one of my favorite epics, and it really is an epic that is about piety. The major character, Aeneas, is called Pious Aeneas. Now, this epic was written for the Emperor Augustus, and Augustus, as we saw in our last session, was trying to show a revived Roman Republic, right? The traditional Roman virtues are something he was really interested in promoting, and one of the purposes for writing of the Aeneid was to promote these virtues. The second virtue, gratuitas, has to do more with sobriety, serious-mindedness, the idea that a Roman should not be given to frivolity and entertainment, but should be, kind of a hard-working, serious individual. And then virtus, the last term that I'm giving you, is really the word for manliness or courage, ultimately. It comes from the word vir, which means man. And it's the word we get virtue from in general. But the virtue here is particularly the virtue of bravery, courage, and manliness. So that's what it meant. The ideal for the traditional Roman was the farmer soldier, right? The model, the farmer soldier, like you would see in the ancient republic. This is the guy that picked up his weapons, went off to war, abandoning his farm, fought for the state, and then went back home to farm the land. This was the epitome of a good Roman, a traditional Roman. The standard was always the way of the ancestors. So this is a very conservative picture, right? Mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors. This is how you did things, the way the elders did it, okay? The manner of the elders. And that's what they would look to. The practical concerns were also interesting. When Romans are known for contributions to world culture and world civilization, they're known most of all for practical matters, practical things like their development of law and government. We already talked about the Roman Republic being a model for the American Republic, right? The United States government modeled after theirs, because they put a lot of thought into crafting this republic. And even though we saw it ultimately collapse, there were flaws in the system, it was still an important innovation, right? This is why the founding fathers of the United States looked at it. They obviously didn't use the exact same system. They modified it according to more recent political theory, but it's influential. Roman law is also going to be something that's going to extend throughout most of European history. Engineering was the other big contribution. The Romans were brilliant engineers and architects. And I know one of the presentations is going to be focusing on Roman innovation in those areas, so I'm not going to talk a lot about that today, even though I have a temptation to want to just focus on architecture. Being an archaeology major, this was one of my favorite things. The creative and artistic side, the Romans were interested in, but they downplayed that. This was not something that they were the most skilled in. They would often turn to Greek artisans or artists to be the model for that aspect of their culture. Though you do have a lot of brilliant poets among Romans themselves. Okay, so I don't want to say that they didn't produce great artistic works. They did, but it was usually influenced directly by the Greeks. Okay, so artistic and creative expression generally followed foreign influences. Etruscan culture. Let's talk about Etruscan culture. Now, itself, Etruscan culture was influenced by the Greeks. Remember, the Etruscans are in central Italy. The Latin tribes are in between them and the Greeks to the south. But the Greeks had a lot of contact and relationship with the Etruscans even before the conflict broke out. Remember, these two sides were at odds with one another. But the Etruscan styles of architecture and art and things like that also come from Greek backdrop. Okay, so there's going to be an influence in Rome, for instance, from the Etruscans in these particular areas. The Etruscans are going to influence Romans in religion, in architecture, surprisingly, in art, and in the fact that they have a written system. Right? They don't necessarily affect Roman literature, though the Romans do translate a lot of works of Etruscan literature, particularly religious documents, but it's really the writing system that they're going to borrow. In religion, which we're going to talk about more specifically when we talk about Roman religion, the legend is that Numa Pompilius, the second king of Rome, is responsible for the religious tradition of Rome, but it's heavily influenced by Etruscan gods, practices of divination or fortune-telling, oracular readings, and the design of temple buildings themselves. And if you remember, Rome was an Etruscan city for a while. It was ruled by Etruscan kings. The last three kings of Rome from around 616 to 509 were Etruscan. And that's when we talked about the development of, the big temple, the major temple in Rome. The temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the Capitoline Temple, was built or began to be built supposedly during that time period. Divination, again, is the telling of the future. I'll talk, I think, more about that when we do religion. But it was very complicated. The Etruscans had all kinds of books on this topic, and the Romans would copy these things. As a matter of fact, gladiatorial games themselves apparently evolved from Etruscan funerary practice of human sacrifice. When it comes to architecture, you've got the design of the tombs. Romans would often copy Etruscan tomb design. Etruscans had wonderful tombs. We could look at some of these more later when we do with religion. But then the temple design, which I just talked about, which was essentially what's called the tripartite temple design. This is something very different from the way Greeks built their temples. Now, most of the time when you look at a Roman temple, you're going to have a tendency to think of it as modeled on the Greek, because there are Greek elements as well. But the overall layout is going to be Etruscan for many of these temples, but the facade will often be Greek in influence. So I'll show you some examples of that in a second. Okay, as far as art goes, you've got Greek influence in the Etruscan art, in the tomb painting. I think we've seen some of the tomb painting before, and in the sculpture. Here's a wonderful archaic sculpture, apparently of the god Apollo from Etruria, done in terracotta, and very, very similar to the what is it called? Archaic style of the Greek kouroi. Okay, so again, you could see in Etruscan art similarities with Greek art, but also some slight distinctions. There's some liveliness and color and stuff that I don't know, I guess is uniquely Etruscan, though again, we don't have much Greek wall painting to really compare, actually any wall painting to compare. As far as writing goes, they had an alphabet. Their alphabet was probably derived from the Greek alphabet, but it was the Etruscan alphabet that was going to be the stepping stone towards the Latin alphabet that the Romans would use. So the Latin alphabet is closest to the Etruscan alphabet, and all of this, of course, goes all the way back to ancient Phoenicia. So I guess you could thank the Punic world for the alphabet in the first place. So that is Etruscan influence. And then when it comes to the status of women, there's some speculation as to Etruscan influence there. Now, the Etruscan women, from what we can tell by their artwork, were somewhat liberated. I don't want to make it sound like in the modern world by any stretch of the imagination, but there was an apparently high status for women in Etruscan culture, which is why on some of the sarcophagi you could see kind of husband and wife displayed together in the art, which did seem to show that there was some closer equality among Etruscan relationships than you might have definitely in a Greek marriage. And the Roman women tended to have a little bit freer status in the world than Greek women did too. So maybe that's due to Etruscan influence, maybe not. It's hard to know. Greek culture, what did they contribute? Well, from the late 8th century, you've got Greek colonies all throughout southern Italy, and trade contact, which influenced the Etruscans and the Latins. But their influence on Rome is going to be in a number of areas. In religion and in myth, the Romans adopted the stories of the Greeks. They didn't have stories of their own gods. Their mythology had to do with the early kings, the heroes of Rome. So when it comes to stories about Jupiter, they just borrow the stories of Zeus, okay? And they do this a lot. So that tends to lead people to think, the religion is actually the same, which it's not. There are differences between Greek and Roman religion, but it's similar enough for our purposes to leave it there for now. Philosophy is going to be something the Romans are going to become attracted to, Greek philosophy, Greek sculpture, Greek architecture. So here's a good example of one of these composite buildings. This is the, I forget the, I don't speak French, I forget how it's pronounced, this little square building. This is an ancient Roman temple that's still standing, Maison Carrée, in Nîmes in France. So what you see there is what looks like a Greek-style temple. Right? If you look at the columns, you could hopefully by now know that's a Corinthian column. You could see the capital, the acanthus leaves at the top, the pediment. You've got the architrave. All the kind of design that you would imagine on a Greek temple is right there on this Roman temple. What you may not notice is the actual format of the temple is very different. Where a Greek temple could be approached from any direction, raised up on the three-step Cryptidina, you've got here a temple that's designed to be approached only from the front. It's raised up on a high podium. This is Etruscan style. Romans would definitely do the same thing. Roman temples, you could usually tell from a Greek temple because it's up on a podium. There's usually a stairway in the front that leads up to it. They are not meant to be approached from the back. So a lot of times these temples would be put into a forum, an open area, kind of pushed up against the back wall of the space. Maybe it had one room, maybe it would have three rooms. There were different ways that these temples were laid out, but you could see that the cella, the naos, the main chamber is kind of back. You don't have necessarily columns going all the way around it. As a matter of fact, in this building, the columns along the side are actually engaged with the wall, right? They're not freestanding columns. They're engaged columns. So there's no walkway around the outside of this temple. That's pretty standard for Roman temples. You're going to see some of them more like Greek than others, but a Roman temple has its own distinctives, and this comes from Etruscan influence. But the architecture itself, the style, very much Greek. Poetry, right? The greatest poets from the Greek world were the inspiration for the poets of the Roman world. Virgil, the Roman poet, modeled his works on Homer. Okay, other guys like Horace and Ovid, Seneca, Catullus. I mean, there are a lot of really important Latin poets, but they all look back at the great poets like Sappho, Homer, etc., from the Greek world. And then in the theater as well, the Romans would build theater on the Greek model, with the one modification being they didn't generally have a round orchestra down in the center. They would often have a semicircular one. So you could very often tell a Roman theater from a Greek theater in that particular design of the semicircular orchestra before the stage, before the proscaeneum. But there are plenty of Roman theaters in the world as well. So Greek style becomes the model for Roman art. Let's take a look at some other pieces that were inspired by Greeks. The Romans begin to expand into southern Italy, obviously, right? And then into Sicily with the First Punic War. You start to have Hellenistic works start to spread into this region of southern Italy, and then these works are ultimately taken as spoils throughout Roman conquest. They're taken back to the city of Rome, and Rome begins to become interested in this new luxury, this new art, this new beauty that's being introduced to their barbaric world. And they really were viewed as barbarians by the Greeks for the most part. In 212, during the Second Punic War, we talked about the siege and conquest of Syracuse by Marcellus. Prior to this event, Rome was supposedly a city decorated by spoils of war, weapons and what they called bloody trophies. And that was the city decoration. At this point, with these statues being brought in, this flood of treasures from places like Syracuse and elsewhere into Rome, Plutarch says that the city becomes decorated. There's an ornament, right? It's to be an ornament for the city, this kind of new art. Okay, in his Life of Marcellus, he talks about this very period, this new stuff becoming the new decorations for the city. He's going to start to take on more of this Greek exterior character. Now, the ultimate conquest of Greece just escalates this process, right? They eventually take over Greece. They take over the Hellenistic empires. There's more and more of this kind of stuff being brought into Rome. Rome starts to adopt these styles. So here's a statue here of this naked individual that I think I showed you when we were doing Hellenistic portraits of kings. Nobody really knows exactly whether this is a Roman general or Hellenistic king. But again, it's this idea of Hellenistic influence in art that is the important part here. Now, the late Republic, the early Empire, lots of Greek artists are operating in Rome, and original Greek statues are being copied in number, usually into marble. A lot of these older bronze statues were put into a marble form. So most of what we have today that seems to be Greek was actually a Roman copy of a Greek statue. Okay, so that's actually pretty common. Most of the Greek stuff is actually lost, especially the bronze. Most of that stuff is actually long gone. Now, there's a reaction to this. There's a love-hate relationship among ancient Romans. Roman citizens loved Greek culture. There's a temptation to it. It's beautiful. But there is the conservative backlash, which sees Greek culture as a threat. Okay? Conservative leaders are actually fearful of this. Cato the Elder being a good example, which is why I introduced him earlier. He's the guy that always constantly called for the destruction of Carthage. Here he is in the 2nd century seeing an encroaching moral corruption on Roman society. He sees luxury and Greek influence as something that's going to soften Roman virtue. It's going to pull us away. And the idea of, corruption in that way always seemed not very believable to me, but the more I think about it, the more I realize a lot of times when people do get accustomed to living a life of luxury, it makes it very difficult to go back in times of necessity to endure hardship, which is often the case. A lot of times you do need to, take up a more austere lifestyle and deal with problems. And he was afraid that the Roman virtue would be lost when confronted with this Greek Hellenistic style luxury. So he wants opposition to these types of things. Here's a famous quote given by Pliny the Elder. He's quoting Cato the Elder in his Natural History. This is apparently what Cato says. He says, "I shall explain what I found out in Athens about these Greeks and demonstrate what advantage there may be in looking into their writings while not taking them too seriously. They are a worthless and unruly tribe." These are the Greeks. "Take this as a prophecy. When those folk give us their writings, they will corrupt everything. All the more if they send their doctors here. They have sworn to kill all barbarians with medicine, and they charge us a fee for doing it in order to be trusted and to work more easily. They call us barbarians too, of course." Okay, so he's kind of giving a warning to the Roman people of the corruption of Greek influence. Of Greek influence. Some people take this very seriously. There's a lot of writings in the late Republic which show kind of a reaction, a desire for the old Roman virtues. There are a lot of stories told about the old Roman heroes trying to rebuild an image of Republican Rome. And one of the big emphases in this area is going to be Augustus himself. Augustus, remember, when he makes his campaign against Antony, characterizes Antony as Eastern, as somebody who has abandoned Roman culture. Antony's Dionysus. Augustus is Apollo. Well, Octavian at the time, right? Us Apollo. It's kind of an East versus West. When he declares war, it's Rome versus Greece. It's Rome versus the Ptolemies. It's Rome versus the Hellenistic kingdom, not Rome versus Rome. All right? There's a reason that he does it this way. After he takes sole control of the Roman state as the first emperor, he actually passes a lot of moral legislation. He tries to strengthen marriage. He makes it, illegal to be single after a certain amount of time as a Roman male. He wants to increase, the child birth rate to shore up the state, but again, to downplay adultery. There were crimes against adultery. The family, he believed, needed to be strengthened. So he tried to pass these laws. Ultimately, they were kind of a failure, as those types of laws often are. But some of the consequences of this type of legislation would be in what happens to the great poet Ovid and his own daughter Julia. Ovid, who wrote a series of poems known as Ars Amatoria, meaning love poems, the art of love, literally, was exiled from Rome because these were a little bit too risque, right? These are kind of erotic poetry written by a great poet, but again, contrary to Roman morality of the era, so Ovid's got to go. of Augustus's daughter Julia, who we just mentioned in our last episode as having been married off to a number of different men in preparation for the succession to the throne. Julia also gained a reputation for being unfaithful as a wife, right? By the way, Augustus's sister, Octavian's sister, Octavia, was a wonderful wife. I already mentioned when she was married to Antony, she's going to become the epitome of a loyal wife. As a matter of fact, she's so loyal to Antony, who betrayed her for Cleopatra, had all these children with Cleopatra. Octavia remained loyal to Antony even after his death. As a matter of fact, she raised the children by Cleopatra, and Mark Antony's children by Cleopatra. That's again how noble a woman she was, and contrast that with Augustus's own daughter Julia. Julia, who was an adulteress in Augustus's eyes, needed to be exiled, and it kind of broke his heart to do that, but he kicked his daughter out of the city of Rome, sent her into exile, again in line with his moral legislation. He was going to try to be consistent with his policy. His official portraiture, interestingly, adopts Greek style, but he adopts classical Greek idealistic style, not Hellenistic style. He doesn't want to go for the nude divine king model. He wants to go for a noble Roman model. So when he's depicted in art, here we have Augustus as general, okay, wearing the Roman armor. This is going to be a standard way to depict emperors from this part forward. He's a military man. He's not nude. Next to him is another statue of him wearing a toga. This was a particularly traditional Roman dress. Right? It's a dignified dress. So this is a rejection, conscious rejection of the Hellenistic styles that he sees as a threat. Now, ultimately, Greece is going to win out. Greek style is going to endure, and it's always going to be there. Greek culture is actually going to officially be accepted by the time we get to the 2nd century A.D. The Emperor Hadrian, who is a great Philhellene, we'll see him later, reigned from 117 to 138 A.D., adopts a lot of Greek style. So even though you have these reactions, you ultimately do have Rome, who conquered the Greeks, ultimately conquered by the Greeks. And that is, in a nutshell, a quick overview of the impact of Etruscan culture and Greek culture on the ancient Romans. Next time, we are going to turn, finally, to Roman religion, and we'll look at some other influence from the Greek and Etruscan world when we deal with that. So until then, that's it.